I'm so thankful to be here today, and I want to thank both the pastor and the church for how much support you've been through these years. I know it's been a long-distance relationship, and I've got to know the pastor a lot more because he helped with my college courses I was taking, and when it's time to have the phone call, who'd you call? The pastor. But I know the church is with him too, so I'm thankful for that. I'm looking forward to being able to present a little bit about what's going on in Suriname this afternoon, and to tell a little bit about the story of how I now show up in this church for the first time with a wife. So just whetting your appetite a little bit. Hope you'll stay around and hear that. So today, if we can start, my apologies that it's going to be a little bit of ping pong today. Normally, I try to stay in one spot, but when you're going to a church and you're only preaching once, then it's a little bit hard to start let's preach 1 Corinthians chapter 1, 1 through 5, which is more like, going through a passage. So I like preaching on a topic. So today, we're going to preach on something, and I want to start by reading in Psalm chapter 19, and starting with verse 5. Psalm chapter 19, verse 5. And this verse has a little bit of history with me. So in Suriname, I do a certain amount of work on the radio. When I'm preaching, I'm doing a lot of my sermon notes on the computer. So I end up sitting inside a lot, behind a computer, which is not my favorite pastime. God didn't make humans to be inside behind computers. He made them to be outside in the sun, right? Okay, everybody has their gift from God. But for me, it was like, at the end of the day, I got to get outside. So one of the things I like to do to unwind was just go outside and run laps. So there was 2 soccer fields in the missionary compound, and I just run laps around the larger one. And it was refreshing. It was like you're free. You're out in the sun. And often it was like, well, the sun's still up. But so this verse was something that kind of related to that feeling of getting out and running. Psalm chapter 19, verse 5, it's talking here about God's handiwork and how he made the stars, the sun. And verse 5 is referring to the sun when it's saying the sun is like a bridegroom coming out of his chamber. And then the second part says, and rejoiceth as a strong man to run a race. Now, when I was running faithfully, when I got out, okay, the first lap, okay, you're warming up. But it was just fun. You were rejoicing. You were running for fun. Now, honestly, if I was racing, I'm not sure how much rejoicing I would be because now it's competition, and this other person's been running too. But when you're by yourself, there's no judgment, right? Yeah. Just as long as you're having fun. But I don't want to preach about rejoicing as a strong man to run a race, because often, and I've been there, you need some encouragement because you're not a strong man running a race. You're a weak man running a race. And today I want to speak about rejoicing as a weak man to run a race. And often in our lives, there are times when we feel weak. We feel overwhelmed. And we're just, to be honest, we're not smart enough to deal with the situations that have come into our pathway. And it's encouraging to know that you're not the first person who's been there, and that the Bible speaks about that a lot. And to know that when I'm weak, as it said in the Bible, it's kind of, saying this now is kind of like a spoiler. When I'm weak, as Paul said, then I am strong. So I want to look at that for a little while. And we're going to go through, let's say, 3 examples of men in the Bible who felt weak, and honestly, they were weak, and God still used them. So let's start in Exodus with Moses. I hope most of you know the story of Moses because we don't have time to go through the whole story of Moses. But we're coming to Moses at a time when he's left Egypt, and he's now 80 years old. He's been a shepherd for the last 40 years, basically unknown. And God's come to him, and God's given him a job. And it's not just a little job. God didn't say, I want you to take these sheep to a different country. God said, I want you to go to Egypt and tell Pharaoh to let my people go. You don't just walk up to the king of the greatest country and say, it's time to end slavery now, let everybody go. It just wasn't. And he comes to Moses and tells him to do that. And I want to read those verses and look at Moses' response. Exodus chapter 3, verse 10 through 11. This is God speaking out of the fiery bush to Moses, and he says, "Come now, therefore, and I will send thee unto Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring forth my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." And Moses said unto God, "Who am I, that I should go unto Pharaoh, and that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt?" And I think sometimes when God gives us a job to do, we can respond this way: who am I to do this job? And I want to bring out an interesting point about Moses. Lord willing, we'll be coming back to the Old Testament, but in Acts, it speaks of Moses and brings out something very interesting. This is Acts chapter 7. When giving Sunday school lessons to kids, Moses turned out to be one of my favorites because he's written about in a couple places. He's written about in Exodus, Acts, and in Hebrews, and you actually get to see a little bit of his thought life. You get almost a little bit more 3D of him. And often we say, well, perhaps this is how it was, but in Acts chapter 7, we actually get to see what Moses was thinking during one particular time in his life. Acts chapter 7, verses 22 through, we'll read through 28. And it says of Moses, "And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was mighty in words and in deeds. And when he was full 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended him and avenged him that was oppressed, and smote the Egyptian. For he supposed his brethren would have understood how that God by his hand would deliver them, but they understood not. And the next day he showed himself unto them as they strove, and would have set them at one again, saying, Sirs, ye are brethren, why do ye wrong one to another? But he that did his neighbor wrong thrust him away, saying, Who made thee a ruler and judge over us? Wilt thou kill me as thou didst the Egyptian yesterday? Then Moses, at this saying, fled, and was a stranger in the land of Midian, where he begat 2 sons. What is the interesting thing I see here? When Moses was about 40 years old, he went out, and it says he was mighty in words and in deeds. The Bible does not tell us what those mighty words and deeds were, but it tells us he was mighty in word, he was a powerful speaker, and in deeds. He did things that were impressive. I would say he was probably a very conspicuous person, most likely in politics, because he was Pharaoh's son in one sense. And it says he went out to see his people, and in verse 25, we get to see a little bit of what he was thinking. Acts 7:25, for he supposed his brethren would have understood how that God by his hand would deliver them, but they understood not. To me, it seems that at the age of 40, Moses felt like he was capable of being used by God to deliver his people. At the age of 40, he felt confident, he felt strong, and he felt like he could take action. And God didn't use him then. Now, 40 years later, at the age of 80, God is telling him to go back to Egypt and go do what now he feels like he can't do. And he says, God, who am I? I suspect, just because of how I am, Moses probably had mixed feelings. He probably also didn't want to go. This was now his new comfort zone. And I think we're that way too. I'm scared to go. I'm not capable of doing this. But if you were in his shoes, would you have blamed him? He's old, he's forgotten, he's unimportant. He used to be somebody, and now he's nobody. But we know the story that God took Moses at this time in his life, not earlier when he was young and strong, but at this point in his life, and used him to do great things. Now, why did God do that? We'll see the answer later. Now I want to go on to Judges chapter 6. And now we'll look at a man by the name of Gideon. Judges chapter 6. Honestly, thinking about Gideon can be an encouragement to me, not because he was such a good person, but because God used him in spite of his weak faith. If I was to look at somebody like Moses, somebody like Abraham, where God told him, do this, and Abraham, just full of faith, forsakes his country. God says, offer your son. And the next morning, he's up and doing it. You see so much faith. And sometimes we're like, well, but I don't have that much faith. I'm more like, God, are you really sure you want me to do this? And we come to Gideon, and we see somebody who sometimes we can relate more to. Somebody who did struggle with, God, is this really what you're telling me to do? Judges chapter 6, and we'll start with verses 11 through 12. And there came an angel of the Lord and sat under an oak which was in Ophrah, that pertained unto Joash the Abiezrite. And his son Gideon threshed wheat by the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him and said unto him, the Lord is with thee, thou mighty man of valor. A little bit of the backstory. Israel is now under oppression from Midianites, and he's hiding, threshing wheat so they won't find him and take it away. And this angel from the Lord comes and tells him that God's with you, you mighty man. Does he look like a mighty man? What is he doing? Is he like hiding in an ambush to like attack these soldiers? No. He's just hiding to survive, just to eat. And then we go to verse 14. In verse 14, and the Lord looked upon him and said, go in this thy might, and thou shalt save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have not I sent thee? And he said unto him, O my Lord, wherewith shall I save Israel? Behold, my family is poor in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house. He's like, God, how am I supposed to do this? My family is not important, and I'm the youngest one. So of all the nobodies, I'm the lowest of them. And again, why did God choose him? And we will see the answer, because it's right in chapter 7. In Judges chapter 7, Gideon has already gone through his time of, if you want to say, questioning, where he asked God, well, if you really want me to go fight, I'm going to put out this fleece, this sheepskin, and I want the ground wet and the fleece dry when the dough comes in the morning. And God does it for him. And he's like, I'm going to ask again. This time I want the fleece wet and the ground dry. And I may have gotten them backwards. And God does it for him again. And he's like, okay, God's showing me to do this. And he blows a trumpet, and the people come together, and now he has an army to go attack the Midianites. And in Judges chapter 7, we read verse 2. And the Lord said unto Gideon, the people that are with thee are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel vaunt themselves against me, saying, mine own hand hath saved me. The whole point was that he was not strong enough. And the whole point is that Moses was not strong enough. And sometimes in our life, the whole point is, no, you are not able to do this by yourself. And if you felt like you were, then you would be lifted up in pride. So God shows us our weakness, and we see our own weakness, and we feel discouraged. But if we rest in God, then what? God uses us, and then he gets the glory. And the whole point was that Gideon was not strong enough. And when they looked like they were going to be strong enough, God said, no, this is too many soldiers. You need to go with fewer. That way you know where the victory came from. So Gideon is our second example. Now I want to look at a much less known character, and that is Zerubbabel. Okay, well, who is Zerubbabel? Well, we read about this in the book of Zechariah. Okay, where is Zechariah? If you go to Matthew and turn into the Old Testament, you run into it really fast. So Zerubbabel is the time when Israel went into captivity. So if you know the Bible stories and how it goes, if you know Daniel in the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, it's after that whole time period when they were in bondage and when other people were speaking for them, they've gotten a chance to go back to their country and they're trying to rebuild. So they've gotten home, but the temple Solomon built is broken down. The wall was broken down. And Zerubbabel is a leader during this time. Zechariah chapter 4. Zechariah chapter 4, verse 7. Zerubbabel is facing an overwhelming task of rebuilding the ruins. Zechariah chapter 4, verse 7. Who art thou, O great mountain? Before Zerubbabel thou shalt become a plain, and he shall bring forth the headstone thereof with shoutings, crying, Grace, grace unto it. Moreover, the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, The hands of Zerubbabel have laid the foundation of this house. His hands shall also finish it, and thou shalt know that the Lord of hosts hath sent me unto you. That phrase in verse 7 where it says, O great mountain, before Zerubbabel thou shalt become a plain. It's probably speaking in a type of symbolic form of the task before Zerubbabel. And it's like a mountain. And it's like, in front of Zerubbabel, this mountain is going to become a plain. And I think in our lives, sometimes we're faced with things where it's like, this is a mountain in my life. It's just overwhelming. And yet still, God can work through us. And before us, that mountain can become a plain. And we're facing things that are overwhelming. And in verse 11, verse 10, I just want to read the first part. It says, For who hath despised the day of small things? I think sometimes when we're serving God and we look at what we're doing, or other people look at what we're doing, it seems like a small thing. If you think of Zerubbabel, especially when we talk about comparisons, because we as humans, we like comparing what we do with somebody else, and when you start comparing things, then you're like, well, I didn't do as good as they did. Who was Zerubbabel up against? Who was the last person who built the temple? Solomon. And the Bible refers that at the time of the laying of the foundation, the people who looked at the foundation, there were two groups. Some were rejoicing, some were weeping. The young ones were rejoicing. The foundation had been laid. The old ones who knew Solomon's temple were weeping because it wasn't as big. And I think sometimes we can look at what we're doing for God and we can compare it to what other people are doing, and we're like, it looks pretty pathetic. Other people's ministries are bigger. And I think this can be in all sorts of areas in our lives. Even young people, they can compare themselves to their friends at school, like, I'm not as smart as them, so I'm not as valuable. I'm not as important. And there's all kinds of ways where we compare ourselves. And here the verse says, And who hath despised the day of small things? Yes, in the eyes of man it looked pathetic, but God was in it. And what did God say? You've begun this, and God sent me to tell you that you're going to finish this. Amen. But how? We skipped that verse. Zechariah chapter 4, verse 6. Then he answered and spake unto me, saying, This is the word of the Lord unto Zerubbabel, saying, Not by might, nor by power, but by my Spirit, saith the Lord of hosts. Zerubbabel, it's not because you're so strong, it's not because you have everything going for you, but it's because I'm in this that you're going to succeed. And he probably didn't have much else going for him. So what do I want to say? And no, we're not nearing the end. We've got a lot to go. But when we look at these three examples, I think they can be an encouragement to us, because there are days when we feel overwhelmed. There are days when we look at our ministry or we look at what we've attempted to do and it's like, I tried really hard, but it doesn't look super impressive. I've done my best. And we feel broken down. There are some days when we just feel like Moses, God, I can't do this. I'm not great enough. Or maybe even like Gideon, well, if you knew my family. God pulls people out of rough families and does stuff with them. And then God sends somebody along, somebody like Zechariah to Zerubbabel, and says, no, it looks pathetic, but God's going to use you. You may be weak, but God's in this. So I hope this can be an encouragement to you, and I want to go on to look at what does God use to do his work. And let's go to the book of 1 Corinthians. In the book of 1 Corinthians, there's a problem in the church, and that's pride and division. And to address that, God speaks through the Apostle Paul and talks about the instruments that God uses. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, and let's start with verse 26. Here we read, but unto them, verse 26, for ye see your calling, brethren, how that not many wise men after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called. When you look at people who have accepted Christ as their Savior, often they're not impressive. They're not the greatest people in the eyes of the world. But in verses 27, we see the people that God does use. But God hath chosen the foolish things of this world to confound the wise. God uses instruments. In this case, we can probably even speak of the cross, because he was talking about the cross of Christ, how it's foolish in the eyes of the world. God uses weak instruments to confound the wise. And sometimes we're that unsophisticated instrument. We're the one who doesn't appear to be, I like the word sophisticated, because in the eyes of the world, when you preach the cross, it's not a sophisticated message.
Yeah, that's right.
When you preach that we are sinners, all of us have done things that we know were wrong, both in word and deed, and even thought and intent, where we've done things deliberately that we knew were wrong, and that the only way to be forgiven is through Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who came and died on a cross and paid for our sins and rose again. And that the only way to receive him is by calling on his name by faith. It's simple, unsophisticated. And in the eyes of the world, it's foolish. And actually the message of 1 Corinthians chapter 2, we need to keep the gospel simple. We need to keep it unsophisticated, because the power is not in our wisdom that we doctor it up, but in the simple power of what God did.
Amen. That's right.
And in verse 27 it says, but God hath chosen the foolish things of this world to confound the wise, and God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. God has chosen Moses out of the wilderness to confound the mighty Pharaoh sitting on the throne. And God chose Gideon hiding behind a tree to be a great army. I think in the Bible it said it was like the sands of the sea. And they didn't even go in with swords in the initial conflict. God chose the weak things. And when we come and look at our own lives, and we're weak, if we're willing to give ourselves into God's hand, God will use us. And God is using us to confound the world. And verse 28 says, and the base things of the world, and the things that are despised, hath God chosen. Yea, the things which are not, to bring to naught the things that are. I like to say it this way. When it talks about base things, despised things, and things that are not, God uses the nothings and nobodies. And what does it say in verse 29? that no flesh should glory in his presence. Amen. God uses the nothings and nobodies, and then it's obvious to everybody that Peter, who's standing in front of this council, he was with Jesus, and that's why he's how he is. And God uses nobodies, and that's what brings him glory. And when going through a hard time in my own life where I was struggling, I was listening to the audio Bible, and in John chapter 1, I heard this verse, and I want to go there. Maybe it can be an encouragement to some of you as well. John chapter 1, verse 42. It says here, John chapter 1, verse 42, and he brought him to Jesus. This was one of the disciples, found Peter, and brought Peter to Jesus. And when Jesus beheld him, he said, Thou art Simon, the son of Jonah. Thou shalt be called Cephas, which is by interpretation a stone. Okay, what was so encouraging to me? The Lord calls Simon who he is. You are Simon, the son of Jonah. That's who he is. And he says, you will be called Cephas, which is interpreted a stone. And I want you to think about that. God takes Peter, who is right here, and God says, this is who you are, but that's who you're going to be called. Amen. And it was a process for Peter. I think Peter was naturally a leader. If you look at how he responded, he naturally took the lead in the group. But as far as spiritual maturity, it didn't come this day. When you read the Bible, I don't think it even came the first year. It took a while for him to gain maturity. We wouldn't have relied on him as a courageous leader in troublous times. We wouldn't have thought, yes, he is reliable. He's a rock. Peter failed. He failed big, and he failed more than once. But God still turned him into Cephas. And I think we can say, who am I? I'm not a rock. I'm not strong. And can God still turn me into Cephas, a rock that others can lean on, a rock that will withstand the attacks of darkness that should sift me like wheat? And I think the answer is yes. When we lean on God, God can use us. Amen. So what is that? You may be here now. You may feel weak now. But God can still work in your life. And God, if you're a Christian, he is working in your life. And he can take you from where you are to where you need to be, to where you're not just strong, but you're strength to others. Amen. And where you're actually a point that other people can find strength at, an encouragement to keep on going in the work. And when we talk about being weak, we have to know where our strength is. And our strength is in God. Paul also struggled with weakness. And it's a very classic verse. It's in 2 Corinthians, where he talks about strength through weakness. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Second Corinthians chapter 12, and we read verses 9 through 10. So Paul had prayed and asked the Lord to remove this, whatever it was, from his life. And this is how the Lord answers him. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. And he said unto me, My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in mine infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then am I strong. And God, Christ, is our strength, spiritually, emotionally, and I would say even physically. when I saw this verse in Psalm chapter 18, where David accredited even his physical victories in battle, even his incredible strength in battle to the Lord, it was like, yes, even our physical strength is from God. We'll start in Psalm chapter 18, verse 1 and 2. I won't read the whole intro. It says, I will love thee, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my strength, in whom I will trust, my buckler and the horn of my salvation and my high tower. And just from personal experience, when we realize we are weak, then we start appreciating that God is a rock. And he becomes our rock. And all of a sudden, these verses, I know when I was struggling, all of a sudden these verses meant a lot more when it's like, yes, God, he is my rock. He is the one I lean on in these hard times. But when we get to verse 31, Psalm chapter 18, verse 31, it says, for who is God save the Lord, or who is a rock save our God? And now listen to this. It is God that girdeth me with strength, and maketh my way perfect. He maketh my feet like hinds' feet, and setteth me upon my high places. He teacheth my hands to war, so that a bow of steel is broken by mine arms. He's like, I'm a great warrior. He's like, but it's God who's given me the strength. It's God who's taught me.
Yeah.
And sometimes, we are athletic or something. And even that is a gift from God, and God gives us our strength. When we talk about God strengthening us, and we talk about times of discouragement, in Isaiah chapter 40, we read about the renewing of strength. Isaiah chapter 40. We'll start with verse 28. Here we read, hast thou not known, hast thou not heard, that the everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, fainteth not, neither is weary. There is no searching of his understanding. Yes, we've heard, yes, we've known, that the eternal creator never gets tired, and he has all understanding.
Right.
I think sometimes we forget to lean on him, though. In verse 29 it says, he giveth power to the faint, and to them that have no might he increaseth strength. If you're weak, if you're feeling faint, God gives strength. In verse 30 it says, even the youths shall faint and be weary, and the young men shall utterly fall. I just want to say, it is normal to feel weak at some point in your life. It is normal to feel overwhelmed at some point in your life. Because we're humans. And God didn't intend us to do the Christian walk in our own strength. But verse 31 says, but they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint. We all get tired, but we all can get our strength renewed. How does that happen? I think it can be a process sometimes. Sometimes it may just be a moment in prayer. Sometimes it may be God sends somebody along like a Zechariah, or like in the New Testament you read of Barnabas being an encourager, who encourages you. And you pray, and you spend time with God, and God starts to heal, and God starts to give you the strength again. It's not a time to give up when you feel you're weak. It's a time to realize that God is your rock, and you need to lean on him so he can be strong through you. And I want you to think, as it was said in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 26, it's normal to be a nobody. And God uses the weak. He uses those that are base. And he uses them to glorify himself. And pastors, deacons, missionaries, evangelists, to tell the truth, they're all just a bunch of nobodies who God is using. And they can suffer weakness, they can suffer doubts, they can be overwhelmed. And God is still our strength. But what does the Bible say? I want to read one final verse in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. When we talk about people who are in the ministry, they can also be weak. They can also suffer doubts and be overwhelmed or feel overwhelmed at moments. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7, what does it say about us as believers? It says, but we have, let's start with verse 6. It says, for God who commanded the light to shine out of darkness has shined in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. But we have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the excellency of the power may be of God and not of us. We are carrying the gospel, but it says we have this treasure in earthen vessels. We're like a clay pot. The treasure's not us. The treasure's what's inside. The gospel that we're giving out, that the excellency of the power may be of God and not of us. So what am I saying? It's not to make you feel guilty if you felt weak, but to encourage you to keep on going. And maybe God has shown you something he wants you to do. Maybe God has given you an assignment. And you feel like, me? I'm not qualified. I'm not strong enough. I'm not smart enough. And God uses us. And God enables us. And at the end we realize that it wasn't me. It was God who strengthened me. So I hope to encourage those who are struggling, who feel weak, overwhelmed, like their attempts to serve God are pathetic, that no, God works through weak, and God enables. Moses didn't want to go. He had some reluctance. He was probably intimidated to go up against Pharaoh and all the chariots, and it wasn't even David and Goliath. It wasn't like he was going to fight with a guy. But God still used him. Gideon was a nobody, and his faith wasn't even very strong. He had to ask God like 3 times to strengthen his faith. Because even the night before the battle, God was like, if you're still questioning, go down into the camp. You'll hear something that will encourage you. He really struggled, and God still used him. As Zerubbabel, he had this overwhelming job, and people didn't think it looked super impressive, and God still used him. And God was glorified in his life. We do get tired because we are weak. But God uses things that are unsophisticated, weak, and not valued to do great things and bring him glory. So be strong. Take time to seek the strength of God. And if God's showing you to do something, take it one step at a time. But if God's with you, he'll help you do it even, and we shall say, especially because you're not able. Because then he is glorified because it was him who did it. Thank you.